In this lab, we are going to be building an HTTP polling solution which allows the user to poll a free dog image API on a predefined interval, returning pictures of random dogs from the internet. We will also have a button to let the user stop polling in case they run across an image they particularly like, and also let them restart the poll whenever they wish. Let's get going. When I'm building an interface like this, the first thing I like to do is get a static UI in place so it's easier to visualize the data streams we will need. After that, I try to work out my observable logic before adding in any side effects, like an API request. Then, once I know all that is working, I add in any side effects needed to finish the job. For this lab, we know we will need some buttons in order to let the user start and stop the poll. So let's go ahead and add those now. So we'll create the first button with an ID of start, and the label will just say start polling. And the second button will have an ID of stop, and it'll say stop polling. And I went ahead and added some basic styles to these IDs just to turn the buttons red and green. It would also be nice to show the current status of the poll as the user clicks on these buttons. So let's also add a paragraph tag, and we'll just say polling status. And within this, we'll make a span with an ID of polling status. And to begin, it'll just say stopped. This is what we can update as the user clicks each button. And let's reformat these elements a little bit so it's a little more clear. So at this point, we have our polling status label and our start and stop polling buttons. The last thing we need is a container to hold our image. So for this, I'm just going to paste in a sample image from the API we'll be using. And the image container will have an ID of dog. So at this point, our display is looking pretty good. We have our polling status label, our start and stop buttons, and we even have an initial image. Now let's add the observable logic needed to actually execute our polling solution. So let's go back to our JavaScript file now. And our first order of business is just creating references to all these elements. So let's create our first constant called start button, and we'll use document.getElementById to grab a reference to our start button. So we'll just supply an ID of start. Next, let's just copy and paste this down, and we'll do the same for our stop button. And the ID will be stop. Finally, we just need to grab a reference to the label, so we'll just call this polling status. And the ID is polling status. So now that we have our elements, we need to create a stream of click events for both our start and stop buttons. So we'll actually add a comment here that just says streams so we can keep these sections separated, and we'll create a constant called start clicks. And we'll actually need the from event operator in order to create our stream of clicks. So let's go ahead and import that now from RxJS. Next, let's call from event, and we'll be passing in our start button. And the event we're listening for is the click event. Next, we can just go ahead and copy this, and we're going to do the same for the stop click. So we'll change the name to stop click, and we'll swap out this start button with the stop button. At this point, let's take a quick pause for a second to talk through what we need to do next. Anytime the user clicks on the start button, we want to start a timer that polls the API on a given interval. For this, we could either use interval or timer, but since it's probably best to poll first immediately on click, timer seems like a better option. We also need to stop polling based on the stop click stream. Anytime we need to limit a stream's lifetime based on an event from another stream, we can think back to the take until operator. Let's go ahead and add the imports for the operators we know we'll need. So we'll add the timer creation operator from RxJS, and we'll also add take until from RxJS/operators. Next, let's create the polling observable. And we'll be using the start click stream since the start polling button is our trigger. So whenever the user clicks the start button, we want to map to our timer interval. Since we are mapping to an inner observable, we know we'll need a flattening operator. Let's start with merge map since the lifetime of the inner observable will be limited based off the stop click. And actually, since we are just going to map to the same interval every time, let's just use the merge map to helper operator. So we can go ahead and add the merge map to import now. At this point, we have everything we need in order to implement our basic polling functionality. So within the pipe method, let's add merge map to. On every emitted click event from the start click stream, we are going to map to a new timer. And for the arguments to timer, let's pass 0, which means the initial value will be emitted immediately, And let's pass 5,000 for the second argument, so a new value will be emitted every 5 seconds after. We also want to limit this based off the stop click stream. So anytime the stop click stream emits a value, we want to complete the inner timer, stopping our poll. To do this, let's call pipe on our timer observable, and we'll use the take until operator. And let's just pass it our stop click stream as a notifier. Finally, let's subscribe and log the emitted values to the console as a checkpoint. And let's go ahead and save, and we'll come over and open up our DevTools. Let's switch to the console tab, and when we click start polling, we'll see the interval start, so after 5 seconds, another value will be emitted. And if we stop, that will stop the interval. Now that we have our start and stop functionality working, let's work on getting our polling status to display correctly. At this point, it is stuck on stop, no matter what the current status of our timer is. So anytime this inner timer starts, we need to update the label to active, and when it's completed, we need to change the label to say stopped. In order to update the label to start, we could use a tap operator within our timer observable, but how do we manage the stop notification? One way to do it would be to create another subscription to the stop click stream, but we can actually do a lot better. Let's actually just trigger this update based on the completion of the inner timer observable using the finalize operator. So let's go ahead and add the tap import and the finalize import now. And within the pipe method, let's first add the tap operator. For tap, we'll pass it a function that updates the inner HTML of the polling status label to say active whenever a value is emitted from the timer interval, which will be immediately. Now, in order to change the label to stopped on completion, we can use finalize. The finalize operator accepts a function which is called once on the completion of an observable. It receives no values, and any return values are just ignored, but it does let you perform some action if needed. So let's pass finalize a function that just updates the label to say stopped. Let's save and make sure everything is working as expected. So when we click on the Start Polling button now, the polling status label is updated to say active, based on the tap operator. If I then click Stop Polling, the observable is completed by take until, which causes the function we passed to finalize to trigger, updating the label to stopped. Now that we have our polling and display logic wired up, let's introduce the actual API call in order to retrieve new images. So let's go ahead and add an import now for the Ajax creation operator. And remember, Ajax comes from its own directory, so we'll just import Ajax from arxjs/ajax. And let's also import switchmap2, as we really only need one active request at a time if the previous lags behind. So on every emission from the timer interval, we're going to switch to an Ajax observable in order to update our dog image. We don't want the tap operator to wait on the response, so let's add switchmap2 under the tap operator now. And we'll use the ajax.getJSON method to create a GET request. And I'm just going to paste in the URL for the endpoint we'll be using. Let's save and see what this response looks like. So let's click on the Start Polling button. And we'll see we get an object back now from our API call containing an image URL property. And now that we have this image URL, we can simply update our image element on the page with a new URL on each emitted item. But first, since we just need the URL string, let's import the pluck operator. And on emitted items from this getJSON observable, we can just grab the URL property by passing the property name to pluck. So at this point, we just have a stream of URLs that we need. Next, let's create a reference to the image element on the page. So I'm going to create a constant, and we'll call it dogImage, and we'll use document.getElementById to grab a reference. Let's jump to our HTML file real quick to grab the ID, which is dog. And we'll just paste it in here. Finally, in the subscribe method, let's update the source property of this image element on any emitted items. So we're receiving the URL, so let's just call dogimage.source and we'll assign the new URL. At this point, everything should be wired up and working, so let's save and see how it all looks. And I'll click on Start Polling, and we see we get a new image. In 5 seconds, the timer will fire again, updating the image source to a new URL. And if we want to stop on an image, we can simply click Stop Polling. This all looks pretty good, but there's one last problem that you may have already noticed that I want to touch on before we end this lesson. Because we are using MergeMap, if we were to click on Start Polling twice before we click Stop, we could actually activate multiple inner timers at once. So what we really want to do is just ignore any further clicks on the Start Polling button as long as there is an active inner observable. Lucky for us, ArcsJS makes this easy with an operator we just recently learned about, ExhaustMap. So let's go ahead and import ExhaustMap now. And to implement this functionality, we just need to replace the MergeMap2 operator with ExhaustMap. So we'll just add ExhaustMap here, and since there's not an ExhaustMap2, we'll just provide a function. Now when we save, the user can click Start Polling as many times as they want, but only one internal timer will ever be running. To recap, we created a stream of click events from the Start button. Then, on every emitted event, we used ExhaustMap to map to a timer observable, emitting a value immediately, then once every 5 seconds. On each emitted item, we updated the polling status label to active, then used SwitchMap2 in order to switch to and flatten a new Ajax observable, initiating a GET request. We then used Pluck to extract the URL from each response, creating an observable of image URL strings. Finally, in our subscribe method, we updated the source of our image element in order to display a new image on each emission. Throughout the process, if the user clicked the Stop Polling button, our Stop Click stream would emit, causing TakeUntil to complete the observable and the function we passed to finalize to be invoked, updating the polling status label.